We started this as a university that is deeply rooted in place, and our roots go back to 19th century industrial engagement, work with the steel and other industries in Sheffield. And the university has evolved through various iterations into becoming Sheffield Hallam, obviously 30 or so years ago now, but the roots do feel very deep in the institution, and they were important to us. Lots of our students come from the region, stay within the region. Lots of our engagement with partners is obviously very regionally focused. But the other thing, obviously, that was context for us was our involvement in some of the national civic debate over the last few years. Our chair of governors, Bob Kerslake, chaired the Civic University Commission, obviously, and then we, as Paul has said, we are hosting the Civic University Network. So I think we felt both given our own history and background, but also given our role around the civic agenda and the Civic University Network, we felt, I guess, a little bit in the spotlight in terms of wanting to really make our CUA a strong statement and a strong example of what a CUA can be, albeit there are many examples, and it's going to be really interesting to hear about others as we go through this session. I think when we started thinking about the CUA, there were probably three propositions that we started with. The first, and to some extent picking up one of the Civic University Commission themes, was that we did want to listen. You know, we wanted to make sure we were hearing voices within the region in particular. From partners, yes, but also to try and get some sense of what were public perceptions of Hallam as an institution. And I'll come on to some of the examples of some of the things we learned from that in a couple of minutes. The second thing was we wanted an agreement that genuinely operated as a strategic framework for the university's civic engagement. So we wanted something that felt real and meaningful and hardwired into how the university operated. So we didn't want something which was a kind of nice agreement, but then, if you like, sat on that sat on the shelf and felt like a sort of a moment in time. We wanted it to feel something that genuinely shaped and drove civic engagement and was relevant to both staff and students across the institution. And the third thing we wanted was we wanted something which would genuinely have some impact. So we wanted something that really kind of sharpened our focus and enabled us to feel like we were making a positive difference. So those three things, if you like, frame that kind of listening, the kind of genuine strategic framework, and the impact. Okay, so I'm going to go now. I'll just, if we kick off the slides, please, Ellen. So I'm going to start with what did we learn about what people thought of us? So we did two things in terms of the listening. We did do some YouGov polling, quite a structured piece of YouGov polling, probably back 12, 18 months ago now, just to try and get a sense of, you know, what do people think of us around South Yorkshire. We focused this on South Yorkshire, which is, if you like, our core region. Although we're Sheffield based, South Yorkshire is very much our region. Some of this, I guess, is difficult to interpret in detail, but I'll come on in a minute to some slightly more specific. So, what did this tell us? It told us more people are proud of us than not proud of us. That's a good thing. But it also, I guess, showed us that a lot of people, more than 50%, if you put together indifferent and not sure, don't necessarily have terribly strong views about Hallam. Go on to the next one. We then tried to narrow that down a little bit to get people to think about, were we making an impact on their area or community? Did we feel part of their community? Did we care about their community? Is what we do noticeable? And again, probably relatively similar patterns that, there is a core of people in South Yorkshire and a kind of core in this public attitude surveying, which says, people are pretty positive about Hallam. People are certainly more positive than negative about Hallam, but equally there's quite large groups that don't have that strong a view. And then the third piece, which was probably in some respects the most useful, was we then started to talk to people about what could we do to make a positive impact. So whether or not you think we already make a positive impact, what could we do? And these were the things that came through as the key messages, and to some extent then went on to shape what was in the CUA. So there's quite a lot here that is I guess around themes that we would want and hope to hear. There's and things which probably chime with the identity and focus of the university. So there's things here around skills and jobs. There's things here around giving opportunities to people from disadvantaged backgrounds. There's things around training the public sector workforce of the future. So things here which I think, while you always have to kind of contextualize to some extent what you learned from these public opinion surveys, I think it showed that there were some things there that we could build on and have built on in the agreement. Second thing we did in terms of listening was talking to partners. And I think one of the themes that may be interesting this morning as we go through the two presentations and the discussion is to unpack a bit, how do we all think about the partner side of civic university agreements? And we've taken an approach which is I think, at least on the surface, a little bit different from the one that a number of you will have taken. Our agreement is a Sheffield Hallam agreement. It's not an agreement with partners. On the other hand, talking to partners was an important part of it. And I'll talk a little bit about what I think are the pros and cons of some of those approaches as we go through. So we spent all the time talking to partners. We talked to them about what was their perception of the current relationship with the university, but also what were some of the areas of focus. And I think what we found through that was, firstly, we do have strong relationships with many of the partners in our region. That was clearly the case. And I don't think there was anyone we were talking to with whom we didn't feel we had a relatively strong relationship. On the other hand, there were very few partners who probably thought in a genuinely coherent way about their relationship with the university as a whole. The relationships were much more with specific bits of the university around specific themes, and finding a person in some of our partner institutions to think about a whole institution relationship was actually quite challenging. And I think that's quite an interesting reflection as well. So the relationships tended to be themed around some quite specific areas. Okay, so those were some of the things we learned about what people thought of us and what they might want from us. We then put that together with the work that we are already doing, and we came up with 4 broad areas for focus for our agreement, and hopefully you'll see some of the themes picking up from some of those early discussions. So we had economy and jobs, education and skills, health and well-being, and community and regeneration. And these were designed both to build on work that is already underway, to provide a framework that was genuinely meaningful, but also to give us opportunities to stretch ourselves beyond our current agenda, but in a way that felt genuinely relevant and pertinent for both partners and the region as a whole. And I'll come on in the next few slides just to say a little bit about how did we frame our agreement around these areas. And I guess just coming back to those, one of those points I raised at the beginning, that we wanted to listen, we wanted this to be strategic, but we also wanted to have impact. So the way we framed the agreement under each of these areas is as a series of commitments. And when we launched this in July, and we did some of our public engagement around the agreement, we launched it very much as a set of commitments from the university to the region. And I won't go through all of these because you can see them, and you can link to the whole agreement in the chat. But I'll just give you a little bit of a flavour of a couple of them in each area, just to try and explain what was in our thinking. So I think just to take the first one there, and this is, I think, an example of, if you like, the hard wiring, the kind of getting this really embedded into the way the university works. All our undergraduates will have an opportunity to undertake real work experience or a work placement. So there's a core thing here around our engagement with local businesses. But what we wanted to do with this was embed this into our core academic delivery. So it's something which is genuinely hardwired. This isn't something that depends on the civic team chivying people along to make it happen. So there's a kind of hardwiring there. And similarly with the, I think the work-based degree apprenticeships, these were things where it was, if you like, pulling out things that we already want to do and positioning them very much in a civic context. But then also what we've tried to do is stretch ourselves a bit. And if we take, for example, expanding our innovation hub at the Sheffield Olympic Legacy Park, attracting new investment and creating jobs, that's very much a kind of new initiative working with partners across the region. And so that combination of kind of hardwiring core business and then also stretching ourselves in new areas comes out in this one. If we go on to the next one, education and skills, again, just one or two examples that will hopefully give an idea of how we've approached this. I'll pick out one of my favorite ones, which is the one at the bottom on the left, developing our newly opened early years community research centre in Shirecliffe. So one of the areas that we've been working on as Hallam for a number of years now is a programme called South Yorkshire Futures, which is about strengthening educational attainment and aspiration within South Yorkshire as a whole. And that's been a programme very deliberately focused on from early years right through to secondary and tertiary. And this initiative is one which we worked on jointly with Sheffield City Council and Save the Children to open a new research nursery in a relatively disadvantaged part of North Sheffield. And how it works from a civic perspective, I guess, and a university perspective is, so we have one of our centres of research expertise helping to shape and design the facility and use it, if you like, as a test bed for learning about what really works in early years education. We had a group of our undergraduate architecture students working on designing the facility and and helping to build something that was really appropriate. We have our education students doing placements, working in the facility, and we have our civic and outreach team and indeed some of our education professionals working with others across the region to disseminate the lessons from this research nursery through the early years services in the 4 local authority areas across South Yorkshire to broaden out these lessons and give them both regional and then wider national impact. And it's kind of that sweet spot of this is something which is drawing in different parts of the university. It's benefiting the university, it's benefiting our students, and it's also generating wider civic impact. And I guess that's the sort of thing we're really trying to reach for in a number of these areas. We'll just click on to the next one, health and well-being. And again, core area for Hallam. We are a very big educator of particularly nursing and allied health students. There's a very specific commitment here, and of course, in the current context of the pandemic and the focus on the health service, commitment to double our annual intake of students studying to become healthcare professionals at the university by 2025. We know that very many of those students will stay on in health service roles in South Yorkshire. So again, that sense of kind of embedding in core university business, but articulating as civic benefit. And then we're also doing a lot of work in this area, bringing in the research. We've just not quite on that one, just jump around research facilities and working with communities across Sheffield and South Yorkshire on health inequality. And particularly, we've been doing a lot of work with communities on post-COVID recovery and addressing long COVID. So again, mix of things. And then just the final set around community and regeneration. So we are in the process of a fairly major redevelopment of our Sheffield city centre campus. We're taking the opportunity of doing that to try to design that in a way which is genuinely a community facility as well as a university facility. There's obviously a moment in time opportunity around that in terms of how do we do that. But one of the commitments we've also made is with our existing facilities as well as our new ones that will provide free or at cost access to all our facilities for regional, community and voluntary groups. And we're working with the local voluntary action centres to facilitate that and to bring that to life. So that we'll just click on to the next one, and then finally we've just underpinned all of those four areas with what we've described as our civic values, which are in taking forward all of this work, a strong focus on sustainability, on community and on inclusion. So that, I hope, gives a flavour of how we've tried to think about it and how we've tried to frame it. I'm just going to go on to a few reflections and I guess potentially prompts for discussion and questions. So if we just drop the slides off now, because I'll just talk this through. I think the first thing is for us, that sense of specificity and trying to get to some really specific commitments has not only shaped the agreement, but it has really added some value, I think, from our perspective. And I think it's done that in two or three different ways. Firstly, it undoubtedly did help us in talking to partners to be able to go out and say, look, here's some really specific things that we're doing and that we're interested in doing. So it was useful in partner and presentational engagement, but it's also helped, I think, to sharpen our focus internally in stopping the agreement just being something that sits on a shelf. And so we've now got a set of commitments, and having committed to them, we have to be really serious about developing them. So there's something there around getting the right level of specificity that I think is quite an interesting area for debate as we go forward with CUAs. The second thing, and I've talked quite a lot about this, so I won't labour it at this point, but that point about really trying to hardwire this into how the university works was and still is, I think, a key theme, and one of the things that I still feel is really important in our approach. I don't want us, and haven't ever wanted us, to be in a position where, if you like, the team leading the CUA are having to work hard to persuade people to do things that deliver the CUA. You know, we want the ownership of the CUA and the things within the CUA to be genuinely spread and owned across the institution, and not feel like a nice to have or an add-on. The third thing, and I have thought quite a lot about this, particularly looking at some other CUAs, is, did we get right our approach to partners? Because as I said at the beginning, we did go for a CUA, which is a Sheffield Hallam CUA. It's our set of commitments. It's not an agreement with partners. It's not an agreement with other universities. And there were, I guess my reflections on that are, it probably did enable us to get to a sharper set of commitments than I suspect we might have been able to get to if we'd gone for the broader partnership approach. So that's, you know, given that that was important for us, it's not necessarily what drove our approach to partnership thinking, but actually I think there is something there that we were able to come up with a set of really specific commitments, which we didn't need to, if you like, negotiate or mediate across a broad group. On the other hand, the risk and you know, almost all of those commitments depend to a greater or lesser extent on partnership working. So I think having done this as a Hallam agreement up front on the basis of discussion with partners rather than negotiated one, it does really put a strong premium on maintaining and embedding partnership working as we go through the implementation of it. So look, I think it'll be interesting to see what other perspectives are, but that's one of my reflections is, actually we probably were able to get to something that was a bit sharper by doing it as a Hallam specific agreement. I've got 5 reflections. That was number 3, just 2 more I'll quickly run through. The fourth one is, there is something, and I think this isn't just about the CUA, it's about how we've tried to approach civic work around agility and funding within the institution. And we have tried to get to a position where we have quite an empowered approach to just getting on with civic activity. And, you know, we've created a funding envelope that we can spend relatively easily. We've been quite flexible in terms of resource and capacity for this. So, and we've we've tried to keep the governance of this pretty light as well. So there's something which is perhaps a little bit counter to traditional university ways of working and structures of governance. We've tried to create a really agile model that enables us just to take opportunities. The research nursery is a really interesting one. It came along, we just said we're going to do this, and then we sort of made it happen. And I think there's something there about being able to seize the opportunity and do these things. And the last one, and I think this is one which is still a challenge for us, but it's going to be an area of focus for the next year or two, is making this feel real, not just for our core partners, but for our community. And going back to where we started with, what do you think of Hallam? What do you know about Hallam? Do you think we make a difference? I think we do want to continue to find ways to not just do the things we've committed to, but make sure that we are still testing public attitudes and perceptions as we go through that. And I think that YouGov polling, we don't want that necessarily to be a one-off exercise. We do want to think hard about how do we genuinely engage with local communities across a geographical area, which in some respects is relatively small, but in other respects actually feels quite large. And the communities, the individual communities within South Yorkshire are very strong, have their own strong identity. And it would be very easy to do nice things in Sheffield and not feel you're making a difference in Doncaster or Barnsley or Rotherham or some of the smaller towns and villages in between. And so that sense of how do we still keep this real and alive for people is also really important for us. Okay, Paul, I think I'm going to stop at that. Hopefully a few reflections there that give you, well, hopefully a picture of how we've approached this, but also some of the things that I've reflected on as we've come to the end of the process.
Great, thank you very much, Richard. And there's lots going on in the chat. And I'm going to come to a couple of people in a minute. Faye, I might come to you and just ask you to ask Richard a bit more about the process. And then I was going to come to Julian and perhaps to Deanne in Manchester to just reflect a little on how you've gone about the partnership working. But I suppose I just wanted to start with a slightly provocative question, which was, how much has this process really changed how you work at Sheffield Hallam? Because you could argue that this was just a little bit about sort of nudging and tweaking and rebadging stuff and giving it a civic flavour. Or you could argue that this has led to, a really quite profound reorientation and a step change in the work. And I just wondered, it's too early to say, isn't it, quite what it will deliver? But how do you see it, Richard?
I think all the areas that we're working in were broadly areas that we were engaged in. But I think what it has done is push us to be much more conscious about what we want to deliver. So scale of ambition and pace of delivery. And I think if you went back to Hallam's civic engagement 3 or 4 years ago, both of those things would have been poorly articulated. So we'd have had activity going on in these areas, but I think it's pushed us. And so examples of that, it's absolutely pushed us to take things which we were doing some of and say, we are going. So some of the commitments around numbers and growth, it's pushed us to really sharpen up our commitments. It's pushed us to make our facilities available to voluntary groups as a public commitment rather than as something that just depended on a few local links. It's pushed our ambition around our engagement in the Sheffield Olympic Legacy Park. Again, there was thinking around that, but it's pushed us to think about it much more strategically. So I would say it has been, the thinking has prompted a genuine step change in ambition. You're right, Paul. We now, we have to keep testing ourselves and do we actually deliver that level of ambition? But the value, I think, again, of the commitments and the specificity of the commitments is, we've gone out to the region and said, here's what we're going to do. We've gone to our governors who are very focused on this and said, here's what we're going to do. So the onus is very much on us to now turn those commitments into reality.
Great. Thank you. And, I think you've talked about it's pushed us, and you've talked about how how this has engaged staff across the university. But Faye, I think, had a really interesting question just about the process. and how you've got that to happen. I don't know, Faye, whether I could come to you and just ask you to put that question.
Yeah, no, thanks, Richard. That's been really interesting, really insightful in many ways. I mean, at Hull, we are currently in the process. We're one of the yes on the poll, developing a civic university agreement. In terms of our direction of travel, whether that is a charter similar to Solent or some kind of commitment rather than agreement. But what I'd be interested in, Richard, is, and I think others too have shared the same thinking, how is it being resourced internally in relation to, the university decided that it was going to make this commitment, but how did you actually get this agreement developed? And I was really interested in your comment about the institutional approach rather than individual areas or disciplines, because that obviously happens a lot within large organisations, particularly HEIs. And I was also interested in the governance arrangements that have been put in place now that the agreement has been set. And as you say, it's on you to deliver as an institution. So, and how are you engaging with partners and stakeholders as part of that governance?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Okay, so how we approached it, and to some extent, how we shaped it is carrying forward into how we're governing it. So having moved, we had a small central team. So we've had a small central team of probably 5 or 6 people who we've built up over the last few years around some of our civic work, supporting the Civic University network, and then leading on into our Civic University agreement. But actually, very much of the work on this has been done by people elsewhere in the university. So having identified relatively quickly those four broad thematic areas, we hadn't necessarily articulated them exactly as we end up, those 4 broad thematic areas. We built then coalitions of people across the university in each of those areas to lead and develop them. So we picked a senior sponsor for each area, but we explicitly gave them a cross-university remit to develop the theme of activity. And I think to some extent, I mean, we all have our own institutional cultures. This does build probably on an increasing theme within Hallam over recent years, which is about a one university approach, a more consistent one university approach on things. So it wasn't entirely countercultural to some of the other things we've been trying to do in the institution, but we did explicitly brief people and ask them to develop a cross university approach on a theme, and to bring together little subgroups of people from across the university to develop those, and trying to empower those groups to come up with something that was ambitious. And then we tried to use the central team, and I guess to some extent my own role, as a kind of support and challenge for those in developing them. And we had a Civic University Agreement steering group, which I chaired with those and some other people in the institution, which again kind of tested, challenge, tried to keep this as something coherent. And we've carried that forward into the governance of the process as a whole. So although I and a couple of others on this call, if you like, have an overall institutional responsibility for this, each of those 4 areas is led by a senior member of staff across the university, for whom that is not, it's not their day job, but it is a core responsibility. And so we tried to get people to think of this as, as something which, where genuinely we take on cross university responsibility. I think it does help, and I won't hide this. It does help that we have a chair of governors who is extremely focused on this agenda. So we are getting, we've got, if you like, that challenge from the board. As an institution, the rooting in civic is strong. But nevertheless, I do think that kind of breadth of ownership across the institution is strong. And we want, where this has worked best and continues to work best, is where people want to do this anyway. And if you like, the Civic University Agreement is capturing and challenging and testing things that they already wanted to do. In many cases, the most positive feedback we've had from people is the process of the CUA has facilitated and enabled them to do more than they otherwise could have done. And I think that, again, it's kind of that power of bringing the institutions weight behind an initiative is you can take a good idea that someone's got in an area and you can grow and stretch it. In terms of the governance, again, we've carried forward that model. In terms of the resourcing, we hold a pot of funding which in practice largely sits in my area with authority to allocate, which enables us to do little things that we need to do. It's not millions of pounds, but it is enough to do those kind of small initiatives, pump priming, testing, bringing in some capacity and support on things. And that's probably been the most important thing. The big money is generally going to come from other sources, or it's going to come from external sources. But that ability just to, spend 20,000 here or 60,000 there or whatever, to kind of push things forward without a lot of process has been important.
Can I just ask, Richard, and I think I think Helen's just popped up. Is that high funding? How are you funding that?
No, we've just taken it essentially out of university core resourcing.
Core business.
Yeah, just out. Yeah, so we've assigned we've assigned a budget to this and to support the team and activity, and we've just said this is part of our identity as an institution, and it's the budget that supports the core team of 6 or 8 people, but it also gives us some non-pay and more flexible funding to do things. So it has been really useful, really.
It's impressive to see the commitment across in a number of ways. So
I mean, my own view on this has always been, if someone wanted to challenge us on is that delivering good value for money from a purely university perspective, I would say over time, absolutely it is. Now, we haven't particularly, that's not how we've had to sell it, because I think the commitment is there. But I do think this is something about taking a slightly more imaginative perspective on the value of upfront investment in this agenda, trusting in its long-term return for the institution as well as the region.
Yeah, I wanted to just pick up on the partnership dynamic and how you've approached that. And I'm going to turn to Julian from Manchester in a second, who's got a very interesting question. But I was very struck, Richard, by how you talked about this, that what you haven't done is kind of co-create an agreement with a number of partners that lays out a kind of joint plan of action for the next X years. You've chosen instead to listen, to be evidence informed, and to be responsive to what your consultation has told you. But what you've done is actually more perhaps pragmatic. You've said, right, we've listened and we've come up with these commitments, and that's what we're going to act upon. You've not chosen to work with the University of Sheffield to do that. You've chosen to do it as Sheffield Hallam, etc. So, you've made some very pragmatic choices. And Julian, I think you wanted to just sort of explore that partnership dynamic a little. Could I just hand to you for a second?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Richard is a brilliant presentation. Thanks. I really enjoyed listening to the process, what kind of goes on behind things. I was really reflecting when listening to what you're saying, that we've got almost a polar opposite approach in Greater Manchester on many levels, and we don't know what's the best approach, and there probably isn't such a thing. There's pros and cons to all of them. So I was interested in your reflection on that, but my reflection listening to you, and just to give a brief 30-second, I know Deanne might say something in my team a bit more later on about what we've done in Greater Manchester, but there's 5 universities have come together with the combined authority, which has a remit already around health, around skills, around transport, etc. So we see that as the sort of democratic body that's determining the priorities through who people vote for, the 2.8 million people who elect the mayor and the leaders of the 10 individual councils. And that's our partner, the combined authority. But we decided early on, first of all, we wanted to do it as a university. Then we spoke to Manchester Met a bit, thinking we could do it as 2 universities in the city. And then actually we worked so closely with the other universities during COVID, and the vice chancellors were meeting literally every Monday night between 6 and 7 p.m. every Monday for the whole of the pandemic. And that created relationships that previously perhaps weren't as strong. Quite informal relationships without big agendas and papers in the usual way we do things in universities. So I thought that was quite interesting. And from that came the prompt to aim to have this CUA, which would cover all of GM. Now, there's advantages and disadvantages, and I think there's almost like a graph I was imagining in my mind between the number of partners and the level of specificity, and the straight line you can draw between that. So ours, we've really struggled, and we've got to do much more work on this in terms of the degree of specificity. I think where we've focused quite a bit, though, is in that relationship with the combined authority and getting the mayor behind it and having an open invitation to the elected political leaders to say, these are the things we think we can do. What do you think? And we'd like to work in unison to deliver against those. And I guess, you know, so this is a long way of asking the question then about the Sheffield University partner potential. Obviously, you've made a decision not to do that. I guess in any city or region where you've got more than one university, there's going to be duplication, there's going to be gaps. And in my university, we're never going to be as good as at degree apprenticeships as perhaps Bolton might be, or Salford University, for example. So, but that's a good thing if it means that we can specialise in what we're good at. And I think in that diversity, hopefully there's strength. And I was just wondering what reflections you'd had given what I've just said, because it seems like, as you say, we've got this very, very different approach.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with what you said at the beginning, that we don't know what is right, and there's not necessarily one version of right on this. I think our choices were to some extent pragmatic ones. You know, it was we were doing this and wanted to create momentum on this during the pandemic, when you know, really intensive partnership working perhaps felt more challenging. I think, you know, we have good relationships with a set of partners, but the partner group, it wasn't entirely obvious how we would draw the lines around the partner group that we might work with if we did a partner agreement. You know, there's some obvious potential partners, but you know, there's choices, and I think we just we felt we could end up in a little bit of going down a bit of a blind alley for a way. Blind alley is probably the wrong phrase, but you know, we felt we could get very sucked into a debate about partnership rather than about what we actually wanted to do. So we made the choice to say, well, look, partnership is important for all the reasons I've talked about, but actually this is our agreement and this is our commitment. I think it'll be really interesting to see how this evolves over the next 2 or 3 years. I think, you know, the implicit or the implication of the approach you've taken, which I think is also, you know, if you prioritize partnership up front, I guess the challenge then is turning that into really specific deliverables. If you prioritize the deliverables up front, then the challenge is making that work through a strong set of partner relationships as you go forward. And I think it'll be fascinating, actually. I think both are entirely, you know, legitimate and interesting approaches, and we'll see where it lands.
Brilliant. Wow. I'm sure everyone is really being helped by this conversation. It certainly has really helped me think about, you know, that challenge. I think you put it, how do you draw the lines around the partnership group? And I think what you suggested, Julian, is you already had a kind of democratic partnership structure within Greater Manchester that was a really apt place in which to do this collective work. I think it's so dependent, isn't it, on our different contexts. There cannot possibly be one right way to do this.